The rain poured down heavily that night, turning the city streets into a blur of flickering lights and rushing water. Pedestrians hurried by, clutching umbrellas, their faces hidden beneath hoods and scarves. No one stopped. No one noticed him. A man sat on the cold pavement, his back pressed against the brick wall of an old building. His clothes were worn, his hands rough and trembling from the chill. He wasn't just another beggar on the street. He was a man who had once dreamed of something bigger, but life had a way of breaking dreams apart, leaving nothing but shattered pieces. People walked past, indifferent to his presence. Some glanced at him briefly, then looked away, as if acknowledging his existence would make them uncomfortable. Others ignored him completely, as if he were invisible. But then, out of the sea of hurried footsteps and distant voices, a black car rolled to a stop. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his shoes polished to perfection. His presence demanded attention. He wasn't just anyone. He was a billionaire. The beggar barely lifted his head. He had seen all kinds of people in his time on the streets. Some who threw coins at him without looking. Others who whispered insults under their breath. He had learned not to expect kindness. But this man, this stranger, did something unexpected. He didn't walk past. He didn't sneer. He knelt down. For a moment, they just stared at each other. The billionaire's eyes held something rare. Genuine curiosity. Maybe even a flicker of recognition. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The beggar hesitated. It had been so long since anyone had cared to ask. "James," he finally muttered, his voice barely audible over the rain. The billionaire nodded, as if he had just confirmed something. Then, without another word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. He held it out. "Take this." James looked at it, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What is it?" $100,000. The words didn't register at first. They felt too unreal, like something out of a dream. James's fingers trembled as he reached for the envelope. It felt heavy, real. He opened it slightly, catching a glimpse of the crisp bills inside. His breath caught in his throat. "Why?" he finally managed to ask. The billionaire smiled, but there was something unreadable in his expression. Because sometimes life gives second chances. It's up to you what you do with it. And just like that, he stood up and walked away, disappearing into the night as swiftly as he had come. James sat there, the envelope clutched tightly in his hands, his mind racing. Was this a trick? A joke? But the money was real. The weight of it, the smell of fresh bills. It was all real. For the first time in years, hope flickered inside him. He didn't sleep that night. His mind was a storm of possibilities. $100,000. Enough to change his life. Enough to rewrite his story. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this act of generosity would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. Because the next day, the billionaire collapsed in tears. And the reason why would shock everyone. The sun barely peeked through the thick clouds the next morning, casting a dull light over the city. James sat on a bench in the park, gripping the envelope tightly in his hands. He hadn't spent a single dollar yet. His mind was still struggling to accept that what had happened the night before was real. $100,000. It was more money than he had seen in his entire life. He could get off the streets. He could eat a proper meal, buy clean clothes, maybe even find a place to stay. But something inside him felt heavy, like a weight pressing on his chest. Why had that billionaire, someone who had everything, chosen him? James had spent years believing that people like him were invisible to the world. No one cared. No one helped. He had accepted that a long time ago. And yet, one man had stopped. One man had given him something that could change his life forever. But why? James needed answers. He didn't know the billionaire's name. He had only seen the man's face for a few moments under the dim streetlights. But something about him had seemed off, not in a dangerous way, but in a way that made James wonder if he had been the only one desperate that night. With nowhere else to go, James wandered the city, looking at the people rushing by. He passed by a coffee shop, staring at the people inside, men and women in suits, sipping expensive drinks, scrolling through their phones. That was a different world, one he had never been a part of. But now he had a chance. Still, something kept pulling him back, a strange feeling in his gut told him that this money was not just a gift. It was something more, something deeper. Meanwhile, in a penthouse overlooking the city, the billionaire sat in his study, his head buried in his hands. Tears streamed down his face, but he made no sound. His chest ached, his heart pounding as if it were trying to break free. He had thought giving the money away would bring him peace. But instead, it had brought back memories he had spent years trying to bury. His name was David Carter, a man who had built an empire from nothing, a man who, on the outside, had everything: wealth, power, success. People admired him, envied him, but they didn't know the truth. No one knew about the boy he used to be, the boy who had once sat on those same cold streets, the boy who had begged for food, who had shivered in the rain, who had known what it felt like to be invisible. No one had stopped for him. No one had handed him an envelope full of money. He had fought, clawed his way out of the darkness, built himself into the man the world now recognized. But deep down, the scars remained, and when he had seen James on that street, it was like looking into a mirror. That night, after he had driven away, the memories had come rushing back. He had spent the night drowning in them, unable to escape the past he had tried so hard to forget. The face of the only person who had ever helped him haunted him, a man who had once given him a chance, a man he had failed to save. David pressed his fingers against his temples, his breath shaky. He needed to know what James would do with the money, not because he doubted him, but because he needed to believe that second chances existed, that maybe, just maybe, the past didn't have to define the future. James, unaware of the billionaire's turmoil, found himself standing outside a bank. The logical part of him told him to go inside, deposit the money, and start fresh. But something kept him frozen in place. He glanced at the people walking in and out of the building, their expressions filled with purpose. He didn't belong there. Not yet. Instead, he walked away, his mind spinning. By nightfall, he found himself in front of an old shelter, a place he had once slept in when there was no other option. The building was run down, the paint peeling, the sign barely legible, but inside it was warm. Inside, people who had nothing found comfort, even if only for a night. James took a deep breath and stepped inside. As he looked around, memories of his own nights here flooded back. The empty stairs, the quiet sobs people tried to hide, the feeling of hopelessness that clung to the air. He saw an old man in the corner, wrapped in a thin blanket, his body frail. A woman sat with her child, whispering a lullaby in the dim light. He had been them once, and just like that, he knew what he had to do. The next morning, David sat in his office, staring blankly at the view. His assistant knocked gently before entering, holding an envelope in her hands. "Sir, you need to see this." David turned slowly, his brows furrowing. She placed the envelope on his desk. It was the same one he had given James, the same one filled with $100,000. But something was different. The money was gone. Instead, there was a handwritten note inside. David picked it up, his hands trembling as he read the words. "You gave me more than just money. You gave me a choice, and I chose to give others a second chance too. Thank you." His breath caught in his throat. His vision blurred as emotion crashed into him like a wave. He covered his mouth, his shoulders shaking as he tried to contain the overwhelming feeling inside him. For the first time in years, the walls he had built around his heart crumbled. He had thought he was giving James a second chance, but in the end, James had given him something even greater. Hope. And in that moment, David Carter, the billionaire who had built an empire, wept. Not out of regret, not out of pain, but because, for the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be free. David sat frozen, the note trembling in his hands. The weight of James's words settled deep in his chest, heavier than any business deal, heavier than all the wealth he had accumulated. He had spent years believing that money was the only power that mattered, that it was the answer to everything. But now, for the first time, he realized that true power wasn't in what he had given. It was in what James had done with it. James had chosen to give it away, not out of fear, not out of guilt, but out of something deeper, understanding. David leaned back in his chair, exhaling a shaky breath. His assistant stood nearby, watching him carefully, unsure if she should say something. She had never seen him like this before. Vulnerable, almost human. "Where is he?" David finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His assistant hesitated. "We're not sure, sir. He left the money at the shelter. He helped repair some things, bought food and clothes for the people there. Then, he just walked away." David's heart clenched. He had to find him. Hours later, he drove through the city, scanning the streets, looking for any sign of James. He wasn't sure what he would say if he found him. Maybe nothing at all. Maybe just, "Thank you." But James was nowhere to be found. Days passed, then weeks, and eventually the world moved on. The money David had given away made its way through the hands of many, changing lives in small but meaningful ways. The shelter flourished, no longer struggling to keep its doors open. People who had lost hope found a new reason to believe in second chances. But James remained a ghost. David, however, never forgot. He often found himself looking out at the city, wondering where James had gone. Was he okay? Had he found a new life? Or had he simply disappeared back into the world that had tried so hard to forget him? One evening, as David walked through the city streets, he passed by a familiar alleyway, the same one where he had first seen James. Something made him stop. There, sitting on a wooden crate, was a man feeding a stray dog. His clothes were still simple, but clean. His posture was different now, stronger, more assured. James. David's heart pounded in his chest. For a moment, he considered walking away, leaving the past where it was. But then, as if sensing his presence, James looked up. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke at first. The weight of everything that had happened between them hung in the air, thick and unspoken. Finally, David took a deep breath. "You disappeared." James smirked slightly, scratching the dog's ear. "Didn't disappear. Just started over." David glanced around, noticing the people passing by. The way some greeted James with a nod, a wave. He wasn't just another invisible man anymore. He was part of something. "You gave it all away," David said. James shrugged. "Not all of it. Kept just enough to get by. The rest, well, it was never really mine to begin with, was it?" David swallowed hard. He had spent his life chasing wealth, believing it was the key to everything. But James, someone who had nothing, had taught him that true wealth had nothing to do with money at all. David reached into his pocket, pulling out a small card. "If you ever need anything," he said, handing it to James. "Call me." James took it, but didn't look at it. Instead, he met David's gaze with something unreadable in his eyes. "I think I'm right where I'm supposed to be." David nodded slowly, understanding in a way he never had before. He had spent so long searching for meaning in numbers, in power, in success. But maybe meaning wasn't something you built. Maybe it was something you gave away. As he walked away, David felt lighter than he had in years. He didn't know if he'd ever see James again. Maybe their paths would cross one day, or maybe they wouldn't. But one thing was certain, that night on the street, David had thought he was saving James. But in the end, James had saved him, and that was enough.